Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Transmedia Arts Seminar. My name is Magda Romanska, and I'm the chair of the seminar. We want to first thank Mahindra Humanities Center for sponsoring our series and Harvard Meta Lab for hosting us. Today, I'm very happy to welcome my colleague KASIA LECH, who is going to be talking about heteroglossia and intelligibility in transmedia theater. KASIA received her PhD from University College of Dublin. She is currently a senior lecturer at Canterbury Christ Church University. Her research and creative practice explore theater through a practice-based and traditional scholarship and focus primarily on theater and multiculturalism, acting, verse, and transnational experience. Her books include The Dramaturgy of Form, Performing Verse in Contemporary Theater, and her second book is coming up from Palgrave, and it's titled Multilingual Dramaturgies Towards New European Theater. KASIA trained at the Polish National Academy of Theatre Arts and also performed internationally. She co-founded Polish Theatre Ireland, a multilingual theatre company based in Dublin and featured in recent publications on Irish theatre. She is an executive director of the Theatre Times and co-convener of Translation Adaptation Dramaturgy Working Group at the International Federation for Theatre Research. I'm very pleased and very happy to welcome KASIA today and to listen to her talk on the relationship between multilingual performance and transmedia.
Thank you, and hello, everyone. It is summer 2003. I am in Greece, in Olympia, together with my year group from the National Academy of Theatre Arts. We have just finished our third year of acting training, and we get to show our exam, two versions of Plautus Asinaria, prepared under the supervision of Professor Mirosław Kocur at a drama school festival at the Floka Amphitheatre. We spent long and warm days in Greece visiting the birthsites of European culture and rehearsing to incorporate Greek musicians and Greek and English languages into our piece. Evenings are for multilingual and intercultural encounters with students from different, predominantly European countries. There is no lingua franca as we do not share one language. Multilingualism is the only way we can encounter each other. We view shows and talk in different languages. Conversations are truly translingual, borrowing from across various linguistic systems and often include gestures. This is how we celebrate our love for theater and our collective and multiple Europeannesses that are at this moment in Olympia, transtemporal, multiple, multilingual, multifocal, and open. A year later, Poland joins the European Union and the excitement spreads across the country. At the drama school, we premiere our multilingual diploma show, Masakra, devised and performed in Czech, Slovak, and Polish. It is our school's collaboration with the Academy of Performing Arts in Prague and the Music Academy of Wrocław. And 3 years later, I live in Dublin, performing and dramaturging multilingual theatre in Polish, Irish, Slovak, English, Lithuanian, and French as part of Polish Theatre Ireland. We are creating, as described by Katy, an aesthetic of interculturalism that is constantly in flux, reforming to reflect history, whether environmental, economic, or political, in human terms. Finally, I start examining multilingualism from a scholarly perspective, both through my practice and examination of the works by others. I currently work in the UK. I speak Polish and English fluently and have basics of French, German, and Spanish. I start with this reflection on my capabilities in relation to multilingualism to follow examples by Judith Butler, Alison Phipps, and Eva Karpinski. Judith Butler calls to give an account of oneself in relation to vexed social and linguistic condition. I acknowledge my perspective is underpinned by simultaneous privilege and marginalization. Working in the UK during the Brexit decade as my own Eastern European identity has become increasingly racialized, I am at the same time very aware of the privilege that underpin my experience of theatre and its Europeannesses. These privileges arise from Europe's colonial past that underpins, following Kate Lowe and Etienne Balibar, its own white European self-definition and self-perceived and self-performed idea of Europe superposition to the other histories and cultures of the world, which are reproduced within its own history and culture. My autobiographical reflection is also an inspiration of Alison Peep's work on the value of visibility of linguistic incompetencies in multilingual research to highlight the value of frustration and a sense of powerlessness in forming ethical connection. Eva Karpiński, who followed Peep's steps, talks about the need to accept not knowing as legitimate epistemic stances in encountering multilingual theater. And that links with the key question of my talk: how transmedia creates alternative opportunities for experience of multilingual theater practice to those based on the need to understand every word and fix meanings. The focus is on how different media components and connectivity between them can challenge the urges for every word understanding and their links with broader sociopolitical stratification and asymmetries. In doing so, the talk also looks at how the creation of meaning in transmedia storytelling can be further understood by exploring multilingual structures. It is based both on performance analysis and qualitative interviews with the artists involved. I take an expansive definition of multilingualism as an interaction between different languages as a systemic means of communication that happen within any space or simultaneously within multiple spaces, whether physical, geographical, sociopolitical, or virtual. And in this sense, multilingualism reflects conditions of living in Western world, not only contemporary, but across time and across economic and social classes. It is a transtemporal condition that evokes both empowerment and violence, perhaps best exemplified in context of Europe through the contrast between multilingualism underpinned by the unprecedented opportunities for diverse cultural encounters opened up by the EU's freedom of movement, and the multilingualism created by the denial of the freedom of movement to people immobilized by and on the physical and metaphorical borders of Europe, echoing the haunting parallel with the multilingual nexus of Nazi concentration camps, to recall Primo Levi. It goes further. UK-based Nigerian poet Inwa Elams described one's English language as a cartography of migration, speaking to a huge proportion of English words being borrowed from other languages and its colonial underpinning. The same could be said for many other languages, like Polish, for example, and in this case rooted in both colonized and colonial experiences. The linguistic belongings of words are not always clear. An English word television comes from Greek, tele meaning far, and Latin vision meaning seeing. Some words are shared between languages. Polish, Spanish, and Chinese share mama for mother. In short, multilingualism permits one lives, language, and culture regardless on how many languages one speaks. This is not a new idea. I'm thinking about Mikhail Bakhtin's I live in a world of other languages, Seamus Heaney's famous points from Frontiers of Writing that language is one of the places we all live. These quotes point not only to multilingualism within everyday communication, the lack of clear and complete separation between languages, but also one's ability to shape these linguistic contexts to make space, which has been a source of empowerment for artists. And Tozake Shange is a striking example here. However, multilingualism is not always visible. Saying what's on the television today, one does not necessarily consider the multilingual underpinning of the question. Even in theater or cinema with surtitles, one often quickly adapts one's receptive strategies and, says Marvin Carson, the surtitles and arguably the multilingualism of the situation become naturalized and invisible. One of the reasons for it is a multilingual paradigm that, despite multilingualism ingrained in one's everyday life in Western world, as Yasmin Yildiz argues, is a key structuring principle that organizes the entire range of modern social life, from the construction of individuals and their proper subjectivities to the formation of disciplines and institutions, as well as emergent collectives such as cultures and nations. It is important to emphasize that I am using monolingual not to stigmatize ability to speak one language or the choice to perform in one language, but in reference to multiple discourses of monolingualism that, to follow Mickey Ball's definition of discourse, have facilitated semiotic and epistemological habits and attitudes that enable and prescribe ways of communicating and thinking based on a quoting intelligibility with semiotic understanding of the words and with comprehensibility. These monolingual discourses, and I'm still following Ball work, are repositories for myth models that became naturalized and taken as obvious truths. Some of these myths include monolingualism as a natural mode of communication. We only need to think about the biblical parable of the Babel Tower that presents monolingualism as a natural condition and explains words monolingualism as a punishment. In Europe, I am focusing now my points as my case studies will come from European context, despite multilingualism reflecting not only contemporary, but also historical conditions of living. Since Renaissance time, the pursuit of linguistic homogeneity has been a major task in Europe, as explored by Matthias Huning, Ulrike Wolk, and Oliver Moliner. As explained by David Gramling, monolingualism is a European invention, and it was once a vehicle for European enlightenment, for mass literacy and organized anti-absolutism. Its popularity overlaps with Johann Gottfried von Herder formulating the idea of nation as the sense of the national identity of people, performed in Europe through national revolutions, separation, unification processes, sweeping across European continent in the 19th century, which in turn has led to one language, one nation expectation that still lingers and leads to hierarchies of power between languages, evokes questions of language control and standardization, impacting, as Alistair Pennycook points out, social relation and the distribution of power. Yasemin and Eva Karpiński describe that within monolingual discourses, the understanding of every word and fixing meanings is presented as necessary to communicate, which is underpinned by the conviction that one can only properly understand, communicate, and experience in one's romanticized mother tongue. In other words, recognition of words and their meanings is confused with intelligibility, and as discussed by influential linguist Larry Smith, intelligibility is a three-part concept, of which recognition of words is only one part. Others are comprehensibility, or recognition of the meaning of the whole sentence in its socio-cultural setting, and interpretability, or recognition of what the speaker is doing through words. Intelligibility is, as more recently argued by Sridhar, based on Smith's study, a dynamic skill. And as several researchers from linguistics has shown, the correlation between recognition of words, comprehensibility, and intelligibility has been, at the very least, overrated. However, there is a correlation between listeners' beliefs about comprehensibility of a speaker and their own perception of the intelligibility, which at the same time is mismatched by the listener's actual ability to understand the speaker's utterance. Translatability is based on assumed translatability of languages and cultures they communicate, and intelligibility and equivalences that Yasin Nourani and Eva Karpiński discuss. In today's talk, I'm interested in multilingual situations that emphasize and explore relationships between languages as systemic means of communication. And for that, I am turning to Bakhtin's concept of heteroglossia as another speech in another's language that thereby has ability to express simultaneously two different intentions or worldviews as dialogically interrelated. Such a double voice discourse can facilitate multiple contradictions that privilege and reinvigorate language, increasing its self-consciousness in relation to an individual, as well as to broader political, linguistic, social, or cultural contexts. Many scholars have interpreted heteroglossia for different fields. In theater, it was most famously Marvin Carlson. In my application of Bakhtin terms, however, I follow its recent reading by Cristina Marinetti and Helena Buffery, who, in contrast to Carlson, both differentiate between Bakhtin's polyphony as multi-language consciousness and experience and heteroglossia. Marinetti proposes to interpret heteroglossia as a subversive space when linguistic and performative practices challenge the monolithic lens of authorial vision, facilitating the juxtaposition of different and often contrasting voices and racialized bodies. And I am interested in heteroglossic situation facilitated by emphasized multilingual interactions and transmedia that work to challenge the urges for every word understanding and their links with broader sociopolitical context. The importance of the question arises not only from the unique relationship between language and transmedia, as both underpinned by technology. I am using Walter Ong's work on language as technology here, but above all from the issue of intelligibility that keeps returning in the scholarship and practice of multilingual theater and how it is linked to introduction of other media to theater. Technological developments like surtitles and translating glasses have opened unprecedented possibilities for the audience to engage with production performed in different languages. In pre-pandemic times, the new technology benefited internationalization and accessibility of theater festivals and provided access points for diverse communities. For example, the smart glasses are used at the Festival d'Avignon, Salzburg Festival, Berlin Ensemble, Polish Powszechny Theatre in Warszawa, Modieska Theatre in Legnica, and Słowacki Theatre in Kraków, amongst others, have been performing shows with Ukrainian and English surtitles, recognizing the shift within their local communities. In the pandemic, the Transmedia has become a platform for theater's virtual mobility and for access, allowing people to see and understand theater from distant contexts, whether geographically, economically, or socially. Chekhov's OS, an experimental game by Arlekin players, featured Mikhail Baryshnikov as Anton Chekhov, speaking in Russian, adding the authenticity to the digital adaptation of Cherry Orchard set inside Chekhov's computer. Marta Strecker directed an audiovisual hip-hop album based on Andrzej Błażewicz's play Polskie Rymowanki albo Ceremonie, Polish Rhymes and Ceremonies, that evokes rituals attached to Polish family meetings as seen by a young Pole born in 1990s, the first generation born in a free Poland. The narrator searches for his identity through the tension between the global aesthetics of English interjections and rap and the traumas of Polish history retold at family gatherings. The production additionally brings Polish Sign Language into it, performed by Agata Mazieńczuk and Elżbieta Ressler, whose presence is emphasized as they are the only humans one encounters, and as women, they contrast the male narrator gender, speaking to the silence and invisibility of certain voices in Polish history as discourse. This is a topic I will come back to in the context of Polish Sign Language. The technological development that allowed a relative easiness and low cost of surtitles also fed to some multilingual collaborations between artists. International actors collaborated in Migrant Shakespeare, Gochman Shakespeare, foreignizing monologues from Shakespeare's plays through accent and context. European Theatre Convention brought together 22 European theatres in different languages to reflect on the pandemic living and the potential rebirth of theatre in a free-to-watch short films. These are important steps in democratizing modes of theatre making and encountering, and have been partly encouraged by Netflix, who has led on the growing global interest in multilingual programming and performances. On the other hand, they speak to what Eva Karpiński describes as the paradoxical effect of neoliberal transformation on the linguistic diversity, with the hegemony on English on the one hand, and the revival of ethno-linguistic particularity on the other. For a start, many of the practices I discussed strengthen the position of English as the theatre's lingua franca, since the surtitles almost always follow the formula from any language to English in an effort of reaching the broadest audiences. The marketability of the work evokes problematic ideas of performance as commodity and assumed translatability of languages and cultures they communicate, their intelligibility equivalences. In other words, the combination of multilingualism and transmedia has, in many cases, encouraged intelligibility based on every word understanding, interchangeability of cultures, which in turn strengthens hierarchies between languages and cultures and violences they promote. Because following works by Pierre Bourdieu and Claire Cramsch, language has not only semiotic informative power, but also much broader symbolic power that shapes our sociopolitical cultural realities, their power structures, and symbolic violences they facilitate. At the same time, transmedia and multilingual contexts both bring to the fore issues of human rights. One's right to choose one language in which one communicates has been discussed as a human right, and the recent Future Stage Research Group at MetaLab's Manifesto has brought to the fore the relationship between performance, transmedia, and human rights. This is something I will come back to in my conclusion. In explaining how transmedia and multilingual theatre can problematize pre-existing conditions of making meanings and offer alternative modes of encounter, I now turn to Magda Romańska talk on key dramaturgical questions in transmedia theatre that concern the agency of the audience, the level of connectivity between elements, and the audience points of access. By exploring these areas, we can understand how transmedia dramaturgy operates in relation to creating new frameworks from human-machine interactions, an audience role within them, and creating, transferring, and shaping knowledge between real and virtual. In multilingual transmedia works, these questions may focus on the agency of the audience to choose how or if they engage with different languages and multilingualism of the piece, the level of connectivity between elements and its impact on how languages and their relationships are staged, and the audience points of access to multilingual elements, including translation and the level of connectivity between the audience and storytelling in different languages. Through these questions, I show how transmedia and multilingualism create and expand heteroglossic contexts, shifting human technology interactions, and through that, problematizing the existing frameworks for multilingual interactions and ultimately human-human interactions, and their links with sociopolitical stratification and asymmetries, and offer nuance, how they give audience a responsibility for shaping these frameworks, how they move the encounter with languages away from every word understanding and towards multidimensional and dialogic experience that are both aesthetic and political. And to make my point, I want to give a spotlight to surtitles as a technology viewed by many practitioners as particularly problematic for multilingual theater making, precisely because of its links with translatability and invisibility of multilingual situation. Jan Loers, Belgian director making multilingual theater for the last 3 decades, states, "The invention of surtitles in theater is somehow a failure of multilingual theater. Before they didn't exist, so we were forced to invent the theater that was multilingual. With surtitles, the multilingual theater stopped. It doesn't exist anymore." Niklas Turensson from Swedish Theater Forrat says that for him, surtitles take away the focus from the immediacy of theater. He explains a decision to stop using them in reference to one of their performances. It felt like people were sitting and reading a novel while the actor was giving them a rock concert. In his work, Turensson used, for example, an illegal radio station instead, illegal as the theater has never got any permission to broadcast, that translated by commenting on the events on the stage. The aspect of surtitles and how they raise questions of orality and literacy in performance has been discussed before. Marvin Carson's meta-theatrical playfulness comes to mind, which he paradoxically discusses in relation to Jan Loers' Needcompany. Carson explains how surtitles, especially when clearly marked as an independent stage language, does not only simply duplicate the speech, can create heteroglossia by functioning as a dialogic tool, facilitating multiple meanings and contradictions that the production creates, in a sense similarly to Turensson's radio station. Carson, in his analysis, focuses on the non-translatory function of surtitles, while I am interested precisely in surtitles as a translatory medium. In multilingual theater, surtitles are often the point of access that can nevertheless be shifted. By shifting the points of access, the production I discussed, unsettle the pre-existing modes of encounters, empower relations underpinning them, and move the encounter with languages as communicators of emotions, knowledge, cultures, away from every word understanding and towards multidimensional and dialogic experiences. The Brussels-based Needcompany, co-founded in 1986 by Loers with Indonesian-born choreographer and performer Grace Ellen Barkey, from the start explored multilingualism in theater. I want to focus on their 2015 production, The Blind Poet, written by Loers in collaboration with the Needcompany composer, Martin Sekhers. Directed and designed by Loers, dramaturged by Elke Jansen, and performed by an ensemble including Barkey in Arabic, English, Dutch, French, Norwegian, and Tunisian. The Blind Poet examines identity in contemporary multicultural Europe through the medium of the 10th and 11th century poetry by Syrian Abu al-Ala al-Ma'ari and Andalusian Valada bint al-Muqtafi. The dramaturgy is structured around 7 biographical portraits of the company members and their family trees, each told in a different language, accompanied by surtitles. In The Blind Poet, the stories interweave, revealing an unexpected web of connection between the stories, diverse cultures, deconstructing the idea that humans need to share language or culture to be community, to have responsibility for each other, because we already share stories. The multilingual stories and their overlaps are one element of dramaturgical strategy by setting up, playing with, and unsettling cultural and linguistic identities of stage persona. One of the most striking examples is Hans Peter Dahl's story. As he talks about his Viking roots, he also reveals that he was too afraid and too high on marijuana to save a drowning child. As Karel van Hersbruck puts it, while the Westerner celebrates his own libertarian freedom on the shores, a child dies in the water. Suddenly we're back in the Mediterranean Europe, on the Mediterranean Sea, where both refugees are drowning in droves while European leaders negotiate their fate. The Blind Poet is a story for a pluralistic community in which languages coexist, intersect, and play with each other, but are not a statement of an identity. Surtitles in the production have the translatory function. In the 2018 London South Bank performances that I witnessed, They were live performed in English in direct response to what has been said on stage. At the same time, through interconnectivity between the speech and surtitles, they created moments of visceral experience, revealing tensions between seeing, hearing, and understanding languages and the act of communicating. The effect was created by the moments in which the written surtitles and the speech came from the same language. In other words, in the moments when orality and writing, or two media, intersected. In London's performances, the actors incorporated seemingly random single words or sentences in English into their monologues, which meant that occasionally one both heard and saw English language. As the production set the surtitles as the only point of access for engagement based on comprehension, emphasized by its reliance on English language as a global language, these intersections momentarily shifted the points of access. However, as one was never prepared for it, very often a realization of an understanding of what has been said came delayed to the reading of the words and hearing them. This in turn created, to use Josephine Mahon's phrase, fusing of sensations, an element of a shock, for me even physical disorientation, or internal conflict between not knowing which sign, verbal or visual, to follow. The anxiety of familiar and unfamiliar, paradoxically, aroused not from not understanding, but from understanding, and in turn, move the question of language and engagement with meanings beyond the semiotics and towards, to follow Mahon's theory, a visceral form of communication that releases the somatic essence of words. This prepared the spectator to experience the final moments of the production in which one hears Mohammed Toukabri delivering the poetry of Abu Alala al-Mari in Arabic and without surtitles, creating not only a sensual experience of rhythms and language, but also providing a contrast to the Western cliché of an Arabic culture that the production referenced before. Verse form helps here as well, since its dialogic relation between words and rhythm, as Peter Brook noted and I have argued elsewhere, challenges the anxiety of intelligibility. It lures spectators need to understand the word, and I'm using WBA's famous words or lulling and hypnotic effects of verse rhythm here. My next example builds on the transmedia, as Romańska discusses, to mimic experience of disability. The intersecting frameworks of language and media, however, move the discussed production away from an attempt to a realist representation of disability and towards positioning the discussion within the context of accessibility and experience thereof, closer to Pedro de Sena's idea that accessible doesn't mean easy or simple. Something can be accessible because it is difficult for everyone. Adam Ziajski is an established theater maker from Poland who graduated from cultural studies at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań. His background is in independent theater and happenings, which he created with his company, Strefa Ciszy, the Sphere of Silence. Ziajski is currently the artistic director and the founder of the Scena Robocza working stage in Poznań, which aims to be a repertoire theater for independent companies and artists creating on the peripheries of cultural landscape defined by Polish mainstream theaters. Its key priorities are a play on the French Revolution motto, freedom, equality, theater. In the 2016 Nie mów nikomu, Don't Tell Anyone, that Ziajski directed and dramaturged from Scena Robocza, we saw stories of deaf people in Poland, and like The Blind Poet, it played with surtitles as a dialogic tool. The play was performed by deaf actors in Polish Sign Language, Lorma, the language of people who are deaf and blind, and in live-typed Polish and English surtitles by Dominika Mroczek-Dąbrowska, as a translation of what the actor signed. The translations were projected on the back wall. During the performances for the international audience, English language surtitles would appear at the end, interpreted live from Polish language surtitles. The prolonging of the translation process is emphasized by the rapid pace of Polish Sign Language, which is quicker, and Lorma, which is much slower than Polish speech and Polish and English typing. Finally, and crucially, Dominika Mroczek-Dąbrowska types Polish words following syntax of Polish Sign Language. So, to use colloquialism, not everything makes an immediate sense, and making errors from typos to grammar mistakes depending on the show. Ziajski reflects, I wanted the surtitles to give an impression of live speech. This speech is in written form. It is the only form of communication for a significant part of the hearing audience. All this is accompanied by a cacophony of sounds unbearable for hearing audience that needs to use headphones in order to handle the noise, highlighting it is the hearing audience that needs the accessibility tools. Considering language as technology, the glitching of translation and the disturbed experience of language for hearing audience reveal what Rosa Menkman would describe as commodification processes. For Łukasz Mirocha, glitches reveal the presence of software and its manipulation of the digital product, and by doing so, its weaknesses. The weighting, the noise, and the errors in Ziajski surtitles are malfunctioning element, but also emphasize how the hegemony of one language, its hegemonic coding, impact upon the other languages and experience thereof. The glitching is emphasized by the reverse hierarchy of languages in comparison with Polish reality. By doing so, it emphasizes, to use Karpiński again, unequal vectors of cultural and economic exchange that operate in any language transaction. But here, refer particularly to exchange between Polish and Polish Sign Language, which is still not recognized as an official language in Poland. And the stories that Ziajski's actors tell from the stage reveal the impact this has on the economic and social reality of them, like, for example, not being able to be educated in a language one speaks. Ziajski multilingual dramaturgy also moves the experience of language beyond semiotics and towards an aesthetic experience. When Kazimierz Mądry draws Lorma alphabet on his partner's hand, a close-up image is displayed on the back wall next to written words. As the deaf actors perform their stories, they use holy powder. As a result, their hands, as they sign their stories, leave colorful marks in the air on their bodies. Ziajski describes it as a personal map of each deaf person's sign language. The multivisual richness of this map creates a contrast to Polish term głuchoniemi, deaf-mute, used in relation to deaf community and connoting that deaf people do not have language, thus Polish Sign Language is not a language. The three languages brought into the realm of visual and their intersections create the linguistic visionscape on the stage. These multiple aesthetic, sensory, and political individual experiences of multilingualism get a point when an audience is invited to co-create new signs in Polish Sign Language. Parts of the performance involve the actors creating new signs that the audience requested by writing words on cards, which in turn attaches a frame of responsibility for multilingual interaction, staged under real-life contexts. So far, I focused on works in which a male director was also a representative of the dominating cultures and languages. My next example is female-led and grows out of multilingual community and its need to connect during the pandemic. The theater is based in Friesland in the northwestern Netherlands and is one of the country's oldest theater companies. Theater is based in Leeuwarden, the capital of the province, but its artistic activity stretches across different locations in Friesland. The province is bilingual, with over half of its residents speaking West Frisian as the first language, which is also the second official language in the Netherlands. The language is closely connected to Southern and North Frisian spoken in Germany, but I will only speak about West Frisian, from now on referred as Frisian. Their show Nacht premiered in the late spring of 2021, directed by Tatiana Pratli and Sieka Marie Valendal, with concept by Åke Schazvama and Karel Hermans, and the use of transmedia grew out of the pandemic and the need to continue the theater's mission to be close and connected, and despite the pandemic and lockdown, find a way to play everywhere in Friesland for the community of Friesland, bringing stories that have not yet been told from all corners of this community. Nacht, night, follows 10 people from Friesland who are awake at night. First, the production starts online. The audience sees an interactive map with voices speaking in Frisian, Dutch, but also a dialect that is spoken in Leeuwarden, in the main city of Friesland. Theater's dramaturg, Nina Tuninsen, says, if you go to the north of Friesland, everything sounds different to the south of Friesland. Framing the voices and languages as based in one location, Friesland, while at the same time giving them specific location on the map, is crucial for how transmedia and multilingual elements in Nacht come together to mobilize what Catherine Brickner and Iona Data describe as translocal imagination that recreates a multiplicity of spatialities within a common space marked not by firm boundaries, but by the intensity and concentration of interactions. In the case of an act, that variables within the space facilitated by transmedia and linguistic heteroglossia make this common space Friesland, but also individual locations in Friesland and the houses of each spectator. In turn, Nacht cultivates a sense of togetherness through a distance, speaking to the reality of the pandemic. Tunisen says that they were very aware that a Nacht, night, that must come to an end was also a metaphor for the COVID pandemic. The audience can click on each location on the map and view a short movie recorded through a window playing on the realist through a keyhole convention that places an audience as someone standing outside of the house seeing intimate moments. The movies introduce 10 fictional characters that speak 10 different languages because of where they are from. The movies are surtitled. The location, the language, and the body of an actor become connected, which gets a point when after the online part, a spectator hears a doorbell. An actor delivers a live, intimate monologue in which liveness, emphasized by one-on-one intimacy, enhances the social value of the encounter. The actor stands outside, recreating the audience-actor relationship from the movies, but this time in contrasting position that also shifts the traditional modes of theater encounter. It is an actor that is a visitor. An audience has no choice who visits them and in which language they speak. The live monologue is not translated, partly relying on Friesland's community translingual abilities arising from their daily communication, and partly building on how the surtitles in the movies allow the audience to get used to different sounds. Tunisen explains, Frisian is a different language, but if you speak Dutch and English, I think it's not that difficult to understand when you're a bit used to hearing it. You will miss some words, of course, but you will get the main story. And partly on the fact that understanding words is not the most important part of this encounter, as the connection facilitated by the physical presences of the actor, whose language and body, through the previous virtual part, is simultaneously linked to a different location and through the map, to the other presences and intimate experiences happening at the same time in other places in Friesland, mobilizing translocal imagination and experience. Sometimes, transmedia and multilingualism may mobilize translocal imagination in a way that is surprising for its translators. Rimini Protokoll was founded in 2000 by Helga Haug, Stefan Kegi, and Daniel Wetzel. Through research and in diverse aesthetics and theater forms, they work to provide opportunities and amplify voices of amateur performers who are experts in their own realities. They know something we're interested in, or because they embody a certain part of society, a certain profession, or certain competence, which has molded them, which informs their thinking and even the way they look. Rimini Protokoll's project 100% City that premiered as 100% Berlin in 2008, and since then happened in nearly 40 cities around the world. This is what I'm focusing on now. It involves amateur actors cast to perform a representative sample of people living in a city, performing the portrait of their city. If one looks at each city as an individual project, 100% is not unproblematic. For example, Janine Hauter has argued that 100% Brussels work to dismantle the unity of national languages and to signal the post-national frame. Some of their work, like in Riga, for example, have explored tensions between languages spoken by Riga communities, Russian and Latvian in particular, dismantling the linguistic power shift. But it is also a project in which the final creative agency sits with a recognized international company rather than experts or cultural insiders. They are commissioned by organizations whose aim often is to promote a city or a version of the city, and some of the versions, like London one, have raised questions about who is and who is not being represented. While those productions are not made to travel in general, they are online for free on the company website. So it's an archive of the core dramaturgical structure that underpins each 100% repeated and reimagined in different linguistic and cultural contexts, because it's the same dramaturgical structure. It's reimagined depending on the context, but the core is the same within each of the 100% city. Helga Haug says that sometimes the participants have already watched some previous shows, and they quote or they get inspired by what the other communities did and how they interacted with each other, encouraging more personal and physical interactions such as hugs or touch. In other words, the online encounter with multilingual communities has shifted their modes for human-to-human encounters. Sarah Cruz and Solomon Lennox study the paradoxical nature of repetition as a way to form and change habitual patterns. Through repetition, one comes to know and study the self, and one is able to forget the self. They look at this concept in relation to boxing training. They propose that boxing is a metaphor for thinking about how individuals consciously and unconsciously adjust the performance of self in responses to social codes and expectations. Their point is that boxing can subvert social conventions that mark bodies and identities through the repeated practice of calling them into questions. Parallelly, the experience of live performance repeated by an online archive or the online archive repeated by a live performance helps to create a web of repeated and yet diverse heteroglossic structures, in turn supporting how different multilingual dramaturgies here cross each other and explore existing linguistic contexts and modes of interactions they underpin, multiplying their potential to shift the modes of encounters and their context, inviting to connect with someone one does not understand and has, at least on the surface, nothing in common with. My talk discussed alternative opportunities that transmedia, by shifting points of access and opening spaces of performance, creates a multilingual theater practice and how it opens different avenues for encounter to those based on every word understanding and translatability. By doing so, it also opens, in broader sense, new modes for multilingual interactions based on co-presence, accepting not knowing, limitations, and difficulties within communication as valid, and listening as visceral and aesthetic experience. The different media components and connectivity between them acted like a prism that revealed and decomposed pre-existing social conditions and asymmetries and hierarchies within them, inviting audience to take responsibility for shaping these frameworks. At the same time, heteroglossic context of the multilingual interactions politicized the points of access and spaces that transmedia opened and revealed the role that language plays within it, bringing me back to one of my earlier points about the link between multilingualism, transmedia, and human rights. Future Stage Research Group at MetaLab has powerfully stated that performance is a human right, freighted with universals and with critical questions such as how might a right to performance built on refined critique or repair the post-war human rights conversation? How does the right scale across the spectrum of the arts from dance to opera, music to theater, video to streaming media, or with respect to bottoms-up versus top-down models of culture? How might it intersect not just the local publics or practices that make up the word performance, but serve as a bridge across people's cultures, social classes, and generation? How might it speak more equitably, translate into a system of property rights for performance and creators? Speaking in a chosen language is a human right. And thus, following the manifesto statement on culture and performance, so is performing in a chosen language or languages without the false framework of translatability. Performing is a human right, encountering performance is a human right, but semiotic understanding of every word is not. In this sense, the current paper shows that the future stages that the manifesto so vividly and inspiringly imagines, and which is underpinned by transmedia awareness, must include a new multilingual awareness, thinking and acting open to and creating new models for communication, and through that, for encounter and belonging. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kasia, for this great lecture. I'm going to open it up and see if anybody has any questions. I would like to make a comment or ask Kasia about her lecture or about any of the ideas that she's just been discussing. If you have a question, you can type it in the chat or in the Q&A. As people are kind of gathering their thoughts, I wanted to Kasia to comment how different cultural contexts can be fraught with meanings depending on the language that is being used in a particular moment. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned your position as an Eastern European in UK, that is sort of ambivalent, and depending on which language you use, you oppressed or you're the oppressor. Yeah, so and that's quite an interesting way of thinking about it, particularly in the global context. What is your sense? How can possibly transmedia help to mitigate some of those discrepancies in context within the global performance traditions?
But I think transmedia shifts how we connect. And by shifting how we connect, it shifts how we think and how we encounter and who has the right to speak for whom. And by that, it shifts how we have engaged traditionally with cultures that we don't understand or have no deep understanding of. So I think this is the possibility, is that shifting of connection. It's shifting how we connect, is broadening, is about unsettling, isn't it? It's about unsettling that only one way to connect possibilities. It's about that simultaneous possibilities that transmedia creates of seeing the same story from a different media perspective, or fragments of that story, and seeing it differently through that. So it makes us also aware of that lens that you're talking about, right? On that position, making, I think, us more also critical into our own modes of encounter.
Yeah, the one kind of thought that came to me was the difference between intelligibility and understanding. Yeah, and the kind of do you have a right to understand the other, and what is the other's responsibility to be understood by you, and what is your responsibility to understand? Like that there is a sort of the hegemony of language shifts and the responsibility towards those who use the majority language versus those who use the minority languages. Yeah, and
absolutely.
And so there is a certain power in the way that a language can operate depending on who is using it. What do you think, like, theater artists are sort of becoming increasingly aware of that? I mean, in our manifesto, we talk about touring as being a kind of a problematic issue right now, and the festivals where when the English is the dominant language, yeah, and the assumption that everything will take place in English or will be translated into English.
I think the artists are definitely growing interest in that, but I think that aspect of that, the right to understand, or the audience right to understand, is a major obstacle. And it is interesting because, yes, on one hand, that English language always raises that issue of commodity, and performance is commodity. But it's not like, sometimes, it's like in Master and Margaret, the devil sometimes does good. Netflix, for example, that is based on, like, that multilingual engagement is based on commodity, has recently produced an episode of a cartoon, one of its cartoons, which is bilingual, and for I guess it was English and Spanish in English language, it was Polish and Spanish in the Polish version, which is not surtitled at all, and in which there is a question. There is a Spanish girl that arrives, and the children asking, "Mommy, do we need to understand to play with each other?" And the mother answers, "You don't have to understand. Laughter is understood in any language." And I thought, I was actually, for Netflix, I was thinking, wow, this, and it was interesting that it grew out from that commodity, that interaction. And I think, in a sense, Netflix is leading there. It's that availability, and a lot of artists who talk about multilingual theater are inspired by film, although not all the examples in the film, I'm thinking Gucci at the moment, the movie, are good examples, but there is an growing interest in that. So it is also, in a sense, connected with how other media are traveling to theater.
I think it comes to, as a big surprise to some of us, the popularity of some of the foreign shows on Netflix, yeah, kind of like global popularity, because the American audiences are at least, movie with the subtitle, the surtitles was always a kind of a mockery on American television, American TV shows. Yeah, it's a kind of a joke, like somebody who's very snobbish will take you to the movie with the subtitle, and it's not, it's not American, kind of a apple pie type of thing. It's something that's utterly other. So it comes as a surprise, at least to me as well, that suddenly Americans came to accept subtitles as a sort of part of the entertainment experience. All right, very good. Anybody else has any questions or any thoughts that they would like to ask KASIA? All right. Okay, thank you so much. This talk will be available on Mahindra Humanities Center website. once we caption it and surtitle it. And I wanted to thank everybody for participating in our lecture today. And special thanks, of course, to Mahindra Humanities Center for sponsoring our series and to MetaLab for hosting us. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.